after a perfect replica of the body, he continued. And they nearly succeeded in getting one. The only thing they never could copy was the eyes. Instead of eyes, the dreaming body has just the glow of awareness. You never realized that before when Kanado used to show you his dreaming body. The new seers could not care less about a perfect replica of the body. In fact, they're not even interested in copying the body at all. But they have kept just the name dreaming body to mean a feeling, a surge of energy that is transported by the movement of the assemblage point to any place in this world, or to any place in the 7 worlds available to men. Don Juan then outlined the procedure for getting to the dreaming body. He said that it starts with an initial act, which by the fact of being sustained breeds unbending intent. Unbending intent leads to internal silence, and internal silence to the inner strength needed to make the assemblage point shift in dreams to suitable positions. He called the sequence the groundwork. The development of control comes after the groundwork has been completed. It consists of systematically maintaining the dreaming position by doggedly holding on to the vision of the dream. Steady practice results in a great facility to hold new dreaming positions with new dreams. Not so much because one gains deliberate control with practice, but because every time this control is exercised, the inner strength gets fortified. Fortified inner strength, in turn, makes the assemblage point shift into dreaming positions which are more and more suitable to fostering sobriety. In other words, dreams by themselves become more and more manageable, even orderly. The development of dreamers is indirect, he went on. That's why the new seers believed we could do dreaming by ourselves, alone. Since dreaming uses a natural built-in shift of the assemblage point, we should need no one to help us. What we badly need is sobriety. No one can give it to us or help us get it except ourselves. Without it, the shift of the assemblage point is chaotic, as our ordinary dreams are chaotic. So all in all, the procedure to get to the dreaming body is impeccability in our daily life. Don Juan explained that once sobriety is acquired and the dreaming positions become increasingly stronger, the next step is to wake up at any dreaming position. He remarked that the maneuver, although made to sound simple, was really a very complex affair, so complex that it requires not only sobriety, but all the attributes of warriorship as well, especially intent. I asked him how intent helps seers wake up at a dreaming position. He replied that intent, being the most sophisticated control of the force of alignment, is what maintains, through the dreamer's sobriety, the alignment of whatever emanations have been lit up by the movement of the assemblage point. Don Juan said that there is one more formidable pitfall of dreaming: the very strength of the dreaming body. For example, it is very easy for the dreaming body to gaze at the eagle's emanations uninterruptedly for long periods of time. But it is also very easy in the end for the dreaming body to be totally consumed by them. Seers who gazed at the eagle's emanations without their dreaming bodies died. Those who gazed at them with their dreaming bodies burned with the fire from within. The new seers solved the problem by seeing in teams. While one seer gazed at the emanations, others stood by, ready to end the scene. How did the new seers see in teams? I asked. They dreamed together, he replied. As you yourself know, it's perfectly possible for a group of seers to activate the same unused emanations. And in this case also, there are no known steps, it just happens. There is no technique to follow. He added that in dreaming together, something in us takes the lead, and suddenly we find ourselves sharing the same view with other dreamers. What happens is that our human condition makes us focus the glow of awareness automatically on the same emanations that other human beings are using. We adjust the position of our assemblage points to fit the others around us. We do that on the right side in our ordinary perception, and we also do it on the left side while dreaming together. Chapter 12. The Nagual Julian. There was a strange excitement in the house. All the seers of Don Juan's party seemed to be so elated that they were actually absent-minded, a thing that I had never witnessed before. The usual high level of energy appeared to have increased. I became very apprehensive. I asked Don Juan about it. He took me to the back patio. We walked in silence for a moment. He said that the time was getting closer for all of them to leave. He was pressing his explanation in order to finish it in time. How do you know that you're closer to leaving? I asked. It is an internal knowledge, he said. You'll know it someday yourself. You see, the Nagual Julian made my assemblage point shift countless times, just as I have made yours shift. Then he left me the task of realigning all those emanations which he had helped me align through these shifts. That is the task that every Nagual is left to do. At any rate, the job of realigning all those emanations paves the way for the peculiar maneuver of lighting up all the emanations inside the cocoon. I have nearly done that. I am about to reach my maximum. Since I am the Nagual, once I do light up all the emanations inside my cocoon, we will all be gone in an instant. I felt I should be sad and weep, but something in me was so overjoyed to hear that the Nagual Juan Matus was about to be free, that I jumped and yelled with sheer delight. I knew that sooner or later I would reach another state of awareness and I would weep with sadness, but that day I was filled with happiness and optimism. I told Don Juan how I felt. He laughed and patted my back. Remember what I've told you, he said. Don't count on emotional realization. Let your assemblage point move first. Then years later, have the realization. We walked to the big room and sat down to talk. Don Juan hesitated for a moment. He looked out of the window. From my chair, I could see the patio. It was early afternoon, a cloudy day. It looked like rain. Thunderhead clouds were moving in from the west. I liked cloudy days. Juan did not. He seemed restless as he tried to find a more comfortable sitting position. Don Juan began his elucidation by commenting that the difficulty in remembering what takes place in heightened awareness is due to the infinitude of positions that the assemblage point can adopt after being loosened from its normal setting. Facility in remembering everything that takes place in normal awareness, on the other hand, has to do with the fixity of the assemblage point on one spot, the spot where it normally sets. He told me that he commiserated with me. He suggested that I accept the difficulty of recollecting and acknowledge that I might fail in my task and never be able to realign all the emanations that he had helped me align. Think of it this way, he said, smiling. You may never be able to remember this very conversation that we are having now, which at this moment seems to you so commonplace, so taken for granted. This, indeed, is the mystery of awareness. Human beings reek of that mystery. We reek of darkness, of things which are inexplicable. To regard ourselves in any other terms is madness, so don't demean the mystery of man in you by feeling sorry for yourself or by trying to rationalize it. Demean the stupidity of man in you by understanding it, but don't apologize for either. Both are needed. One of the great maneuvers of stalkers is to pit the mystery against the stupidity in each of us. He explained that stalking practices are not something one can rejoice in. In fact, they're downright objectionable. Knowing this, the new seers realized that it would be against everybody's interest to discuss or practice the principles of stalking in normal awareness. I pointed out to him an incongruity. He had said that there's no way for warriors to act in the world while they are in heightened awareness, and he had also said that stalking is simply behaving with people in specific ways. The two statements contradict each other. By not teaching in normal awareness, I was referring only to teaching it to a Nagual, he said. The purpose of stalking is twofold. First, to move the assemblage point as steadily and safely as possible, and nothing can do the job as well as stalking. Second, to imprint its principles at such a deep level that the human inventory is bypassed, as is the natural reaction of refusing and judging something that may be offensive to reason. I told him that I sincerely doubted I could judge or refuse anything like that. He laughed and said that I couldn't be an exception, that I would react like everyone else once I heard about the deeds of a master stalker, such as his benefactor, the Nagual Julian. I am not exaggerating when I tell you that the Nagual Julian was the most extraordinary stalker I have ever met. You have already heard about his stalking skills from everybody else, but I've never told you what he did to me. I wanted to make it clear to him that I had not heard anything about the Nagual Julian from anyone. Just before I voiced my protest, a strange feeling of uncertainty swept over me. Don Juan seemed to know instantly what I was feeling. He chuckled with delight. You can't remember him because will is not available to you. You need a life of impeccability and a great surplus of energy, and then will might be necessary. I'm going to tell you the story of how the Nagual Julian behaved when I first met him. If you judge him and find his behavior objectionable while you are in heightened awareness, think of how revolted you might be with him in normal awareness. I protested that he was setting me up. He assured me that all he wanted to do with his story was to illustrate the manner in which stalkers operate and the reasons why they do it. The Nagual Julian was the last of the old-time stalkers, he went on. He was a stalker, not so much because of the circumstances of his life, but because that was the bent of his character. Don Juan explained that the new seers saw that there are two main groups of human beings, those who care about others and those who do not. In between these two extremes, they saw an endless mixture of the two. The Nagual Julian belonged to the category of men who do not care. Don Juan classified himself as belonging to the opposite category. But didn't you tell me that the Nagual Julian was generous? That he would give you the shirt off his back? I asked. He certainly was, Don Juan replied. Not only was he generous, he was also utterly charming, winning. He was always deeply and sincerely interested in everybody around him. He was kind and open, gave away everything he had to anyone who needed it, or to anyone he happened to like. He was, in turn, loved by everyone because being a master stalker, he conveyed to them his true feelings. He didn't give a plugged nickel for any of them. I didn't say anything, but Don Juan was aware of my sense of disbelief or even distress at what he was saying. He chuckled and shook his head from side to side. That's stalking, he said. You see, I haven't even begun my story of the Nagual Julian, and you are already annoyed. He exploded into a giant laugh as I tried to explain what I was feeling. The Nagual Julian didn't care about anyone, he continued. That's why he could help people. And he did. He gave them the shirt off his back because he didn't give a fig about them. You mean, Don Juan, that the only ones who help their fellow men are those who don't give a damn about them? I asked, truly miffed. That's what stalkers say, he said, with a beaming smile. The Nagual Julian, for instance, was a fabulous curer. He helped thousands and thousands of people, but he never took credit for it. He let people believe that a woman seer of his party was the cure. Now, if he had been a man who cared for his fellow men, he would have demanded acknowledgement. Those who care for others care for themselves and demand recognition where recognition is due. Don Juan said that he, since he belonged to the category of those who care for their fellow men, had never helped anyone. He felt awkward with generosity. He couldn't even conceive being loved as the Nagual Julian was, and he would certainly feel stupid giving anyone the shirt off his back. I care so much for my fellow man, he continued, that I don't do anything for him. I wouldn't know what to do, and I would always have the nagging sense that I was imposing my will on him with my gifts. Naturally, I have overcome these feelings with the warrior's way. Any warrior can be successful with people, as the Nagual Julian was, provided he moves his assemblage point to a position where it is immaterial whether people like him, dislike him, or ignore him. That's not the same. Don Juan said that when he first became aware of the stalker's principles, as I was then doing, he was as distressed as he could be. The Nagual Elias, who was very much like Don Juan, explained to him that stalkers like the Nagual Julian are natural leaders of people. They can help people do anything. The Nagual Elias said that these warriors can help people to get cured, Don Juan read, or they can help them to get ill. They can help them to find happiness, or they can help them to find sorrow. I suggested to the Nagual Elias that instead of saying these warriors help people, we should say that they affect people. He said that they don't just affect people, but that they actively herd them around. Don Juan chuckled and looked at me fixedly. There was a mischievous glint in his eyes. Strange, isn't it? He asked. The way stalkers arranged what they see about people. Then Don Juan started his story about the Nagual Julian. He said that the Nagual Julian spent many, many years waiting for an apprentice Nagual. He stumbled on Don Juan one day while returning home after a short visit with acquaintances in a nearby village. He was, in fact, thinking about the apprentice Nagual as he walked on the road when he heard a loud gunshot and saw people scrambling in every direction. He ran with them into the bushes by the side of the road and only came out from his hiding place at the sight of a group of people gathered around someone wounded, lying on the ground. The wounded person was, of course, the Juan, who had been shot by the tyrannical foreman. The Nagual Julian saw instantly that Don Juan was a special man whose cocoon was divided into 4 sections instead of 2. He also realized that Don Juan was badly wounded. He knew that he had no time to waste. His wish had been fulfilled, but he had to work fast before anyone sensed what was going on. He held his head and cried, "They've shot my son!" He was traveling with one of the female seers of his party, a husky Indian woman who always officiated publicly as his mean, shrewish wife. They were an excellent team of stalkers. He cued the woman seer, and she also started weeping and wailing for their son, who was unconscious and bleeding to death. The Nagual Julian begged the onlookers not to call the authorities, but rather to help him move his son to his house in the city, which was some distance away. He offered money to some strong young men if they would carry his wounded, dying son. The men carried Don Juan to the Nagual Julian's house. The Nagual was very generous with them and paid them handsomely. The men were so touched by the grieving couple who had cried all the way to the house that they refused to take the money. But the Nagual Julian insisted that they take it to give his son luck. For a few days, Don Juan didn't know what to think about the kind couple who had taken him into their home. He said that to him, the Nagual Julian appeared as an almost senile old man. He was not an Indian, but was married to a young, irascible, fat Indian wife, who was as physically strong as she was ill-tempered. Don Juan thought that she was definitely a curer, judging by the way she treated his wound and by the quantities of medicinal plants stashed away in the room where they had put him. The woman also dominated the old man and made him tend to Don Juan's wound every day. They had made a bed for Don Juan out of a thick floor mat, and the old man had a terrible time kneeling down to reach him. Don Juan had to fight not to laugh at the comical sight of the frail old man trying his best to bend his knees. Don Juan said that while the old man washed his wound, he would mumble incessantly. He had a vacant look in his eyes. His hands shook, and his body trembled from head to toe. When he was down on his knees, he could never get up by himself. He would call his wife, yelling in a raspy voice filled with contained anger. The wife would come into the room, and both of them would get into a horrible argument. Often she would walk out, leaving the old man to get up by himself. Don Juan assured me that he had never felt so sorry for anyone as he felt for that poor, kind old man. Many times he wanted to rise and help him up, but he could hardly move himself. Once the old man spent half an hour cursing and yelling as he puffed and crawled like a slug before he dragged himself to the door and painfully lifted himself up to a standing position. He explained to Don Juan that his poor health was due to advanced age, broken bones that had not mended properly, and rheumatism. Don Juan said that the old man raised his eyes toward heaven and confessed to Don Juan that he was the most wretched man on earth. He had come to the cure for help and had ended up marrying her and becoming a slave. I asked the old man why he didn't leave, Don Juan continued. The old man's eyes widened with fear. He choked on his own saliva trying to hush me, and then he went rigid and fell down like a log on the floor next to my bed, trying to make me stop talking. You don't know what you're saying. You don't know what you're saying. Nobody can run away from this place, the old man kept on repeating, with a wild expression in his eyes. And I believed him. I was convinced that he was more miserable, more wretched than I had ever been myself. And with every day that passed, I became more and more uncomfortable in that house. The food was great, and the woman was always out curing people, so I was left with the old man. We talked a lot about my life. I liked to talk. I told him that I had no money to pay him for his kindness, but I would do anything to help him. He told me that he was beyond help, that he was ready to die, so that if I really meant what I said, he would appreciate it if I would marry his wife after he died. Right then I knew the old man was nuts, and right then I also knew that I had to run away as soon as possible. Don Juan said that when he was well enough to walk around unaided, his benefactor gave him a chilling demonstration of his ability as a stalker. Without any warning or preamble, he put Don Juan face to face with an inorganic living being. Sensing that Don Juan was planning to run away, he seized the opportunity to scare him with an ally that was somehow able to look like a monstrous man. The sight of that ally nearly drove me insane, Don Juan continued. I couldn't believe my eyes, and yet the monster was right in front of me, and the frail old man was next to me, whimpering and begging the monster to spare his life. You see, my benefactor was like the old saints. He could dole out his food a piece at a time, and I was reacting to it. I didn't know that. All I could see, with my very own eyes, was a horrendous creature advancing on us, ready to tear us apart, limb from limb. The moment the ally lurched onto us, hissing like a serpent, I passed out cold. When I came to my senses again, the old man told me that he had made a deal with the creature. He explained to Don Juan that the man had agreed to let both of them live, provided Don Juan entered the man's service. Don Juan apprehensively asked what was involved in the service. The old man replied that it would be slavery, but pointed out that Don Juan's life had nearly ended a few days back when he had been shot. Had not he and his wife come along to stop the bleeding, Don Juan would surely have died. So there was really very little to bargain with, or to bargain for. The monstrous man knew that, and had him over a barrel. The old man told Don Juan to stop vacillating and accept the deal, because if he refused, the monstrous man, who was listening behind the door, would burst in and kill them both on the spot and be done with it. I had enough nerve to ask the frail old man, who was shaking like a leaf, how the man would kill us. Don Juan went on. He said that the monster planned to break all the bones in our bodies, starting with our feet, as we screamed in unspeakable agony, and that it would take at least 5 days for us to die. I accepted that man's conditions instantly. The old man, with tears in his eyes, congratulated me and said the deal wasn't really that bad. We were going to be more prisoners than slaves of the monstrous man. But we would eat at least twice a day, and since we had life, we could work for our freedom. We could plot, connive, and fight our way out of that hell. Don Juan smiled and then broke into laughter. He had known beforehand how I would feel about the Nagual Julian. I told you you'd be upset, he said. I really don't understand, Don Juan, I said. What was the point of putting on such an elaborate masquerade? The point is very simple, he said, still smiling. This is another method of teaching, a very good one. It requires tremendous imagination and tremendous control on the part of the teacher. My method of teaching is closer to what you consider teaching. It requires a tremendous amount of words. I go to the extremes of talking. The Nagual Julian went to the extremes of stalking. Don Juan said that there were two methods of teaching among the seers. He was familiar with both of them. He preferred the one that called for explaining everything and letting the other person know the course of action beforehand. It was a system that fostered freedom, choice, and understanding. His benefactor's method, on the other hand, was more coercive and did not allow for choice or understanding. Its great advantage was that it forced warriors to live the seer's concepts directly, with no intermediary elucidation. Don Juan explained that everything his benefactor did to him was a masterpiece of strategy. Every one of the Nagual Julian's words and actions was deliberately selected to cause a particular effect. His art was to provide his words and actions with the most suitable context, so that they would have the necessary impact. That's the stalker's method, Don Juan went on. It fosters not understanding, but total realization. For instance, it took me a lifetime to understand what he had done to me by making me face the ally, although I realized all that without any explanation, as I lived that experience. I've told you that Genaro, for example, doesn't understand what he does, but his realization of what he is doing is as keen as it can be. That's because his assemblage point was moved by the stalker's method. He said that if the assemblage point is forced out of its customary setting by the method of explaining everything, as is in my case, there is always the need for someone else, not only to help in the actual dislodging of the assemblage point, but in dispensing the explanations of what is going on. But if the assemblage point is moved by the stalker's method, as in his own case or Genaro's, there is only a need for the initial catalytic act that yanks the point from its location. Don Juan said that when the Nagual Julian made him face the monstrous-looking ally, his assemblage point moved under the impact of fear. So intense a fright as that caused by the confrontation coupled with his weak physical condition, was ideal for dislodging his assemblage point. In order to offset the injurious effects of fright, its impact had to be cushioned, but not minimized. Explaining what was happening would have minimized fear. What the Nagual Julian wanted was to make sure that he could use that initial catalytic fright as many times as he needed it, but he also wanted to make sure that he could cushion its devastating impact. That was the reason for his masquerade. The more elaborate and dramatic his stories were, the greater their cushioning effect. If he himself seemed to be in the same boat with Don Juan, the fright would not be as intense as if Don Juan were alone. With his penchant for drama, Don Juan went on, my benefactor was able to move my assemblage point enough to imbue me right away with an overpowering feeling for the two basic qualities of warriors: sustained effort and unbending intent. I knew that in order to be free again someday, I would have to work in an orderly and steady fashion, and in cooperation with the frail old man, who, in my opinion, needed my help as much as I needed his. I knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that was what I wanted to do more than anything else in life. I didn't get to talk to Don Juan again until 2 days later. We were in Oaxaca, strolling in the main square in the early morning. There were children walking to school, people going to church, a few men sitting on the benches, and taxi drivers waiting for tourists from the main hotel. It goes without saying, the most difficult thing in the world is to make the assembly move. Don Juan said. That movement is the completion of the warrior's quest. Go on from there is another quest. It is the seer's quest. He repeated that in the warrior's way, the shift of the assemblage point is everything. The old seers absolutely failed to realize this truth. They thought the movement of the point was like a marker that determined their positions on a scale of worth. They never conceived that it was that very position which determined what they perceived. The stalker's method, Don Juan went on, in the hands of a master stalker like the Nagual Julian, accounts for stupendous shifts of the assemblage point. These are very solid changes. You see, by buttressing the apprentice, the stalker teacher gets the apprentice's full cooperation and full participation. To get anybody's full cooperation and full participation is about the most important outcome of the stalker's method. And Nagual Julian was the best at getting both of them. Don Juan said that there was no way for him to describe the turmoil that he went through as he found out little by little about the richness and the complexity of the Nagual Julian's personality and life. As long as Don Juan faced a scared, frail old man who seemed helpless, he was fairly at ease, comfortable. But one day, soon after they had made the deal with what Don Juan thought of as a monstrous-looking man, his comfort was shot to pieces when the Nagual Julian gave Don Juan another unnerving demonstration of his stalking skills. Although Don Juan was quite well by then, the Nagual Julian still slept in the same room with him in order to nurse him. When he woke up that day, he announced to Don Juan that their captor was gone for a couple of days, which meant that he didn't have to act like an old man. He confided to Don Juan that he only pretended to be old in order to fool the monstrous-looking man. Without giving Don Juan time to think, he jumped up from his mat with incredible agility. He bent over and dunked his head in a pot of water and kept it there for a while. When he straightened up, his hair was jet black. The gray hair had washed away. And Don Juan was looking at a man he had never seen before, a man perhaps in his late 30s. He flexed his muscles, breathed deeply, and stretched every part of his body as if he had been too long inside a constricting cage. When I saw the Nagual Julian as a young man, I thought that he was indeed the devil, Don Juan went on. I closed my eyes and knew that my end was near. The Nagual Julian laughed until he was crying. Don Juan said that the Nagual Julian then put him at ease by making him shift back and forth between the right side and the left side ways. For 2 days, the young man pranced around the house, Don Juan. He told me stories about his life and jokes that sent me reeling around the room with laughter. But what was even more exciting was the way his wife had changed. She was actually thin and beautiful. I thought she was a completely different woman. I raved about how complete her change was and how beautiful she looked. The young man said that when their captor was away, she was actually another woman. Don Juan laughed and said that his devilish benefactor was telling the truth. The woman was really another seal of the Nagual's party. Don Juan asked the young man why they pretended to be what they were not. The young man looked at Don Juan, his eyes filled with tears, and said that the mysteries of the world are indeed unfathomable. He and his young wife had been caught by inexplicable forces and had to protect themselves with that pretense. The reason why he carried on the way he did as a feeble old man was that their captor was always peeping in through cracks in the doors. He begged Don Juan to forgive him for having fooled him. Don Juan asked who that monstrous-looking man was. With a deep sigh, the young man confessed that he couldn't even guess. He told Don Juan that although he himself was an educated man, a famous actor in the theater in Mexico City, he was at a loss for explanations. All he knew was that he had come to be treated for the consumption that he had suffered from for many years. He was near death when his relatives brought him to meet the cure. She helped him to get well, and he fell madly in love with the beautiful young Indian and married her. His plans were to take her to the capital so they could get rich with her curing ability. Before they started on the trip to Mexico City, she warned him that they had to disguise themselves in order to escape a sorcerer. She explained to him that her mother had also been a curer and had been taught curing by that master sorcerer, who had demanded that she, the daughter, stay with him for life. The young man said that he had refused to ask his wife about that relationship. He only wanted to free her, so he disguised himself as an old man and disguised her as a fat woman. Their story did not end happily. The horrible man caught them and kept them as prisoners. They didn't dare to take off their disguise in front of that nightmarish man, and in his presence they carried on as if they hated each other. But in reality, they pined for each other and lived only for the short times when that man was away. Don Juan said that the young man embraced him and told him that the room where Don Juan was sleeping was the only safe place in the house. Would he please go out and be on the lookout while he made love to his wife? The house shook with their passion, while I sat by the door, feeling guilty for listening and scared to death that the man would come back anyway. Sure enough, I heard him coming into the house. I banged on the door, and when they didn't answer, I walked in. The young woman was asleep, naked, and the young man was nowhere in sight. I had never seen a beautiful naked woman in my life. I was still very weak. I heard the monstrous man rattling outside. My embarrassment and my fear were so great that I passed out. The story about the Nagual Julian's doings annoyed me no end. I told Don Juan that I had failed to understand the value of the Nagual Julian's stalking skills. Don Juan listened to me without making a single comment and let me ramble on and on. When we finally sat down on a bench, I was very tired. I didn't know what to say when he asked me why his account of the Nagual Julian's method of teaching had upset me so much. I can't shake off the feeling that he was a prankster, I finally said. Pranksters don't teach anything deliberately with their pranks, Don Juan retorted. The Nagual Julian played dramas, magical dramas, that required a movement by some which voice. He seems like a very selfish person to me, I insisted. He seems like that to me, because you are judging, he replied. You are being a moralist. myself living in his house for years. I judged him, I feared him, and I envied him in that order. I also loved him. My envy was greater than my love. I envied his ease, his mysterious capacity to be young or old at will. I envied his flair and, above all, his influence on whoever happened to be around. It would drive me up the walls to hear him engage people in the most interesting conversation. He always had something to say. I never did, and I always felt incompetent, left out. Don Juan's revelations made me feel ill at ease. I wished that he would change the subject, for I didn't want to hear that he was like me. In my opinion, he was indeed unequaled. He obviously knew how I felt. He laughed, patted my back. What I am trying to do with the story of my envy, he went on, is to point out to you something of great importance, that the position of the assemblage point dictates how we behave and how we feel. My great flaw at that time was that I could not understand this principle. I was raw. I lived through self-importance just as you do, because that was where my assemblage point was lodged. You see, I hadn't learned yet that the way to move that point is to establish new habits, to will it to move. When it did move, it was as if I had just discovered that the only way to deal with peerless warriors like my benefactor is not to have self-importance, so that one can celebrate them unbiasedly. He said that realizations are of two kinds. One is just pep talk, great outbursts of emotion and nothing more. The other is the product of a shift of the assemblage point. It is not coupled with an emotional outburst, but with action. The emotional realizations come years later, after warriors have solidified by usage the new position of their assemblage points. The Nagual Julian tirelessly guided all of us to that kind of shift, Don Juan. He got from all of us total cooperation and total participation in these bigger-than-life dramas. For instance, with his drama of the young man and his wife and their captive, he had my undivided attention and concern. To me, the story of the old man who was young was very consistent. I had seen the monstrous-looking man with my very own eyes, which meant that the young man got my undying affiliation. Don Juan said that the Nagual Julian was a magician, a conjurer who could handle the force of will to a degree that would be incomprehensible to the average man. His dramas included magical characters summoned by the force of intent, like the inorganic being that could adopt a grotesque human form. The Nagual Julian was so impeccable, that he could force anyone's assemblage point to shift and align emanations that would make him perceive whatever the Nagual Julian wanted. For example, he could look very old or very young for his age, depending on what he wanted to accomplish. And all anyone who knew the Nagual would say about his age was that it fluctuated. During the 32 years that I knew him, he was at times not much older than you are now, and at other times he was so wretchedly old that he could not even walk. Don Juan said that under his benefactor's guidance, his assemblage point moved unnoticeably, and yet profoundly. For instance, out of nowhere one day, he realized that he had a fear that on the one hand made no sense to him at all, and on the other made all the sense in the world. My fear was that through stupidity, I would lose my chance to be free, and I would repeat my father's life. There was nothing wrong with my father's life. He lived and died no better and no worse than most men. The important point is that my assemblage point had moved, and I realized one day that my father's life and death hadn't amounted to my benefactor told me that my father and mother had lived and died just to have me, and that their own parents had done the same for them. He said that warriors were different, and that they they shift their assemblage points enough to realize the tremendous price that has been paid for their lives. This shift gives them the respect and awe that their parents never felt for life in general, or for being alive in particular. Don Juan said that not only was the Nagual Julian successful in guiding his apprentices to move their assemblage points, but that he enjoyed himself tremendously while doing it. He certainly entertained himself immensely with me, Don Juan went on. When the other seers of my party began to come years later, even I looked forward to the preposterous situations that he created and developed with each one of them. When the Nagual Julian left the world, delight went away with him and never came back. Canero delights us sometimes, but no one can take the Nagual Julian's place. His dramas were always bigger than life. I assure you, we didn't know what enjoyment was until we saw what he did when some of those dramas backfired on him. Don Juan rose from his favorite bench. He turned to me. His eyes were brilliant and peaceful. If you are ever so dumb as to fail in your task, he said, you must have at least enough energy to move your assemblage point in order to come to this bench. Sit down here for an instant, free of thoughts and desires. I will try to come here from wherever I am and collect you. I promise you that I will try. He then broke into a great laugh, as if the scope of his promise was too ludicrous to be believed. These words should be said in the late afternoon, he said, still laughing. Never in the morning. The morning makes one feel optimistic, and such words lose their meaning. Chapter 13. The Earth's Boost. Let's walk on the road to Oaxaca, Don Juan said to me. Canaro is waiting for us somewhere along the way. His request took me by surprise. I'd been waiting all day for him to continue his explanation. We left his house and walked in silence through the town to the unpaved highway. We walked leisurely for a long time. Suddenly Don Juan began to talk. I've been telling you all along about the great findings that the old seers made, he said. Just as they found out that organic life is not the only life present on Earth, they also discovered the Earth itself is a living being. He waited a moment before continuing. He smiled at me as if inviting me to make a comment. I couldn't think of anything to say. The old seers saw that the Earth has a cocoon, he went on. They saw that there is a ball encasing the Earth, a luminous cocoon that entraps the evil's emanations. The Earth is a gigantic, sentient being, subjected to the same forces we are. He explained that the old seers, on discovering this, became immediately interested in the practical uses of that knowledge. The result of their interest was that the most elaborate categories of their sorcery had to do with the Earth. They considered the Earth to be the ultimate source of everything we are. Don Juan reaffirmed that the old seers were not mistaken in this respect, because the Earth is indeed our ultimate source. He didn't say anything else until we met Canaro about a mile away. He was waiting for us, sitting on a rock by the side of the road. He greeted me with great warmth. He said to me that we should climb up to the top of some small rugged mountains covered with hardy vegetation. The three of us are going to sit against a rock, Don Juan said to me, and look at the sunlight as it is reflected on the eastern mountains. When the sun goes down behind the western peaks, the earth may let you see the light. When we reached the top of a mountain, we sat down, as Don Juan had said, with our backs against a rock. Don Juan made me sit in between the two of them. I asked him what he was planning to do. His cryptic statements and his long silences were ominous. I felt terribly apprehensive. He didn't answer me. He kept on talking as if I had not spoken at all. It was the old seers who, in discovering that perception is alignment, he said, stumbled onto something monumental. The sad part is that their aberrations again kept them from knowing what they had accomplished. He pointed at the mountain range east of the small valley where the town is located. There is enough glitter in those mountains to jolt your assemblage point, he said to me. Just before the sun goes down behind the western peaks, you will have a few moments to catch all the glitter you need. The magic that opens the earth's doors is made of eternal silence, plus anything that shines. What exactly should I do? I asked. Both of them examined me. I thought I saw in their eyes a mixture of curiosity and revulsion. Just cut off internal dialogue, Rohan said to me. I had an intense pang of anxiety. I had no confidence that I could do it at will. After an initial moment of nagging frustration, I resigned myself just to relax. I looked around. I noticed that we were high enough to look down into the long, narrow valley. More than half of it was in the late afternoon shadows. The sun was still shining on the foothills of the eastern range of mountains on the other side of the valley. The sunlight made the eroded mountains look ochre, while the more distant bluish peaks had acquired a purple tone. You do realize that you've done this before, don't you? Don Juan said to me in a whisper. I told him that I had not realized anything. We've sat here before on other occasions, he insisted. But that doesn't matter, because this occasion is the one that will count. Today, with the help of Genaro, you are going to find the key that unlocks everything. You won't be able to use it as yet, but you'll know what it is, where it is. Seers pay the heaviest prices to know that. You, yourself, have been paying your dues all these years. He explained that what he called the key to everything was the first-hand knowledge that the earth is a sentient being, and as such can give warriors a tremendous boost. It is an impulse that comes from the awareness of the earth itself at the instant in which the emanations inside warriors' cocoons are aligned with the appropriate emanations inside the earth's cocoon. Since both the earth and man are sentient beings, their emanations coincide, or rather, the earth has all the emanations present in man and all the emanations that are present in all sentient beings, organic and inorganic for that matter. When a moment of alignment takes place, sentient beings use that alignment in a limited way and perceive their world. Warriors can use that alignment either to perceive, like everyone else, or as a boost that allows them to enter unimaginable worlds. I've been waiting for you to ask me the only meaningful question you can ask, but you never ask it, he continued. You are hooked on asking about whether the mystery of it all is inside us. You came close enough. The unknown is not really inside the cocoon of man in the emanations untouched by awareness, and yet it is there in a manner of speaking. This is the point you haven't understood. When I told you that we can assemble 7 worlds besides the one we know, you took it as being an eternal affair because your total bias is to believe that you are only imagining everything you do with us. Therefore, you have never asked me where the unknown is. For years, I have circled with my hand to point to everything around us, and I have told you that the unknown is there. You never made the connection. Genaro began to laugh, then coughed and stood up. He still hasn't made the connection, he said to Don Juan. I admitted to them that if there was a connection to be made, I had failed to make it. Don Juan restated over and over that the portion of emanations inside man's cocoon is in there only for awareness, and that awareness is matching that portion of emanations with the same portion of emanations at large. They are called emanations at large because they are immense. And to say that outside man's cocoon is the unknowable is to say that within the Earth's cocoon is the unknowable. However, inside the Earth's cocoon is also the unknown, and inside man's cocoon, the unknown is the emanations untouched by awareness. When the glow of awareness touches them, they become active and can be aligned with the corresponding emanations at large. Once that happens, the unknown is perceived and becomes the known. I'm too dumb, Don Juan. You have to break it down into smaller pieces for me, I said. Genaro is going to break it up for you, Don Juan retorted. Genaro stood up and started doing the same gate power that he had done before when he circled an enormous flat rock in a cornfield by his house while Don Juan had watched in fascination. This time, Don Juan whispered in my ear that I should try to hear Genaro's movements, especially the movements of his thighs as they went up against his chest every time he stepped. I followed Genaro's movements with my eyes. In a few seconds, I felt that some part of me had gotten trapped in Genaro's legs. The movement of his thighs would not let me go. I felt as if I were walking with him. I was even out of breath. Then I realized that I was actually following Genaro. I was in fact walking with him away from the place where we had been sitting. I didn't see Don Juan, just Genaro walking ahead of me in the same strange manner. We walked for hours and hours. My fatigue was so intense that I got a terrible headache and suddenly I got sick. Genaro stopped walking and came to my side. There was an intense glare around us, and the light was reflected in Genaro's features. His eyes glowed. Don't look at Genaro, a voice spoke. Look around. I obeyed. I thought I was in hell. The shock of seeing the surroundings was so great that I screamed in terror, but there was no sound to my voice. Around me was the most vivid picture of all the descriptions of hell in my Catholic upbringing. I was seeing a reddish world, hot and oppressive, dark and cavernous, with no sky, no light but the malignant reflections of reddish lights that kept on moving around us at great speed. Genaro started to walk again and something pulled me with him. The force that was making me follow Genaro also kept me from looking around. My awareness was glued to Genaro's movements. I saw Genaro plop down, as if he were utterly exhausted. The instant he touched the ground and stretched himself to rest, something was released in me, and I was able again to look around. Don Juan was watching me inquisitively. I was standing up, facing him. We were at the same place where we had sat down, a wide, rocky ledge on top of a small mountain. Genaro was panting and wheezing, and so was I. I was covered with perspiration. My hair was dripping wet. My clothes were soaked, as if I had been dunked in a river. My God, what's going on? I exclaimed in utter seriousness and concern. The exclamation sounded so silly that Don Juan and Genaro started to laugh. We're trying to make you understand alignment, Genaro said. Don Juan gently helped me to sit down. He sat by me. Do you remember what happened? He asked. I told him that I did, and he insisted that I tell him exactly what I had seen. His request was incongruous with what he had told me, that the only value of my experiences was the movement of my assemblagement and not the content of my visions. He explained that Genaro had tried to help me before in very much the same fashion as he had just done, but that I could never remember anything. He said that Genaro had guided my assemblage point this time, as he had done before, to assemble a world with another of the great bands of emanations. There was a long silence. I was numb, shocked, yet my awareness was as keen as it had ever been. I thought I had finally understood what alignment was. Something inside me, which I had been activating without knowing how, gave me the certainty that I had comprehended a great truth. I think you're beginning to gather your own momentum, Don Juan said to me. Let's go home. You've had enough for one day. Oh, come on, Genaro said.
He's stronger than a bull. He's got to be pushed a little further.
No, Don Juan said emphatically. We've got to save his strength. He's only got so much of it. Genaro insisted that we stay. He looked at me and winked.
Look,
he said to me, pointing to the eastern range of mountains. The sun has hardly moved an inch over those mountains, and yet you plodded in hell for hours and hours. Don't you find that overwhelming? Don't scare him unnecessarily, Don Juan protested, almost vehemently. It was then that I saw their maneuvers. At that moment, the voice of seeing told me that Don Juan and Genaro were a team of superb stalkers playing with me. It was Don Juan who always pushed me beyond my limits, but he always let Genaro lead the heavy. That day at Genaro's house, when I reached a dangerous state of hysterical fright as Genaro questioned Don Juan whether I should be pushed, and Don Juan assured me that Genaro was enjoying himself at my expense, Genaro was actually worried. My seeing was so shocking to me that I began to laugh. Both Don Juan and Genaro looked at me with surprise. Then Don Juan seemed to realize at once what was going through my mind. He told Genaro, and both of them laughed like children. You're coming of age, Don Juan said to me. Right on time. You're neither too stupid nor too bright, just like me. You're not like me and your aberrations. There you are more like the Nagual Jr., except that he was brilliant. He stood up and stretched his back. He looked at me with the most piercing, ferocious eyes I had ever seen. I looked up. A Nagual never lets anyone know that he is in charge, he said to me. A Nagual comes and goes without leaving a trace. That freedom is what makes him a Nagual. His eyes glared for an instant, and then they were covered by a cloud of mellowness, kindness, humanness. They were again Don Juan's eyes. I could hardly keep my balance. I was swooning helplessly. Genaro jumped to my side and helped me to sit down. Both of them sat down flanking me. You are going to catch Lucy from Earth, Don Juan said to me, warning. Think about the Nagual's eyes, Genaro said to me in the other. The boost will come when you see the glitter on the top of that mountain, Don Juan said, and pointed to the highest peak on the eastern range. You'll never see the Nagual's eyes again, Genaro whispered. Go wherever it takes you, Don Juan said. Think of the Nagual's eyes, you'll realize that there are two sides to a coin, Genaro whispered. I wanted to think about what both of them were saying, but my thoughts did not obey me. Something was pressing down on me. I felt I was shrinking. I had a sensation of nausea. I saw the evening shadows advancing rapidly up the sides of those eastern mountains. I had the feeling that I was running after them. Here we go, Genaro said in my ear. Watch the big peak. Watch the glitter, Don Juan said in my other ear. There was, indeed, a point of intense brilliance where Don Juan had pointed, on the highest peak of the range. I watched the last ray of sunlight being reflected on it. I felt a hole in the pit of my stomach, just as if I were on a roller coaster. I felt, rather than heard, a faraway earthquake rumble, which abruptly overtook me. The seismic waves were so loud and so enormous